Recording in progress. That seems to be our cue. So hello, everybody. I'll give people a chance to trickle back in. To introduce myself, my name is Nick Rocklin. I am the RDM specialist with UBC's Advanced Research Computing, as well as the co-chair of the Portage National Training and Education Group, among other things. And first of all, I just want to give a big shout out to all of our speakers. It's so great to hear all these different facets of such a large concept being distilled into just really approachable terms and facilitating a lot of great discussion. I know that Jeff and Karen are looming out there as well as Bo. I'm going to give them a second to get back on before we jump into the questions. Now, there are several questions in the Q&A that I'm going to go through, and I do appreciate all of our presenters vigorously answering the questions via text, but I might resurrect some of those previously answered questions because I do think that the answers are really valuable and would benefit more than just the textual box. But starting off that actually, because I think that this is a really important question that Ernie asked. He was curious about the adequacy of skill sets required at the institutional level to carry out data from the active stage to the preservation and reuse stage. And really preparing fair data deposits requires certain know-how. And how equipped are we for this? Are there any directions that we're going to help better equip us for that? And I believe that was a question that Bo answered. So I might start with you, Bo, but this I'm sure is something that everyone else can jump in on as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I know it's one that I've talked to Ernie about a long time ago, even. And I think we got to look at glass full, glass empty, half empty kind of thing. And I think we're moving in the right direction, and we're building up these skill sets. And certainly in the repository space, the work we're doing at DRAG and the certification project, I think, is trying to build up those skills and build awareness. So I think we're moving in the right direction. I don't know if others have an opinion.
Yeah, I'll circle back to the group that Nick co-chairs, and that's the National Training Expert Group. I think training is so important in all of this. If we don't have, from two perspectives, if we don't have data specialists, data librarians, research facilitators who are up to speed on RDM, research data management, then we're lost. But I think we're making progress on that front. We also, I think, have to think about training for researchers, particularly earlier career researchers who are the future of everything we're doing. Getting them up to speed on the best practices or the wise practices or the good practices associated with research data management has been a huge part of the work that we've been doing over the past number of years. And I concur completely with Bo that this is a glass half full scenario, not a glass half empty. I think we're making good progress, and we just have to keep working at it.
That's great. Danielle, did you have anything to add to that? I think you're a little outside of the Canadian context, so no problem if not.
Oh, I think that especially what was being emphasized by Karen about the idea of having distributed labor and having networks is a really important model for doing this work effectively. It's just unreasonable to assume that every institution is going to be able to reproduce the expertise locally. And I've been especially impressed by the more networked approaches. In the US, we're working with the Data Curation Network that has that kind of model. I do think it's also important to recognize that there's a lot of opportunity to reskill within libraries, and there are a number of different organizations that have tried to intervene in this space, such as the Carpentries, so that's something that's worthwhile. And then finally, on the issue of building up researcher capacity, I definitely think it's important for emerging or junior researchers, but something that I think is important to emphasize is that these are skills that are needed at every level. And even though, it can be harder to imagine intervening with those who are more established, given the continuity that folks in those positions have and the direct training relationship they have with students, it's really important to also work with them.
And if I could just throw one more thing there, one of the initiatives that we're working on right now is a Data Champions program that would we're really trying to affect a change in the culture of research. And researchers, as much as we'd like to think that they listen to the library crowd with attentive ears and jump at our every pronouncement, they listen to their peers far more. And so we're hoping that by bringing data champions into the mix, researchers who themselves are enthusiastic about and informed about research data management, speaking with their peers and looking for ways of advancing data management within disciplines, within regions, within institutions. I think we're hoping that will prove to be another of many approaches to responding to the concern that Ernie raised.
Yeah, that's great. And I fully agree with the networked approach is awesome. What they're doing with the data curation network is great. There's this moment where everyone in Canada has to build these strategies together. So I think there potentially could be an opportunity for that type of coordination. And Jeff, the the champions, it does have to come from the research community as well. So those are great answers. I'm going to resurrect another question from the dead, because I do think that there's a follow-up, and it's a great question. It's about data curation and the expectations that potentially repositories are to require curation practices, and it's up to the researchers to deposit data, but then that's not always the case. And it was talking about whether we're promoting best practices or actually enforcing curation. And Chantel was asking Jeff, after you answered, that the expectation that repositories provide curation as per the policy statement is different than just promoting best practices of curation. And if these are not being provided by the actual infrastructure in which data is being deposited, to what degree are institutions responsible for providing curation services to the institutional dataverses, or just data deposits in general? Jeff, I might pick on you for that one because you started with the answer, but it's a layered question, I understand.
It's a very, it's a challenging question, because there's such a diversity of institutions who fall under the policy, and there's, as a consequence of that, such a diversity of capacity. So there are larger institutions who have invested more and have the capacity to invest more in research data management support in a variety of forms. And that could be in the library, that could be in IT, that could be part of an ethics component. It could be part of the Office of Research. So there are a whole range of places where institutions would theoretically and some practically invest in research data management. That some have lower or less capacity to do that doesn't change the need for us to move forward with raising that capacity or raising that ability. And institutions individually and collectively should be moving toward that, providing more support. And if it means leaning on resources from Alliance RDM to sort of inform researchers, and people on campus who would then point to Alliance RDM resources for research data management, whether it means turning to training resources and videos, whether it means turning, as was referred to earlier, to networks of support, maybe a curation network. We do have a nascent digital sort of data curation network being worked on in Canada. So there are a number of ways in which this is being addressed. Is it there today? No. So it's just something that we have to keep working toward.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Move the needle a little bit every day. Bo, Danielle, did you have anything to add to comments around data curation?
I just want to hear more about this nascent group that's being developed. Something that I'm especially conscious of that's a bit challenging in the Canadian context is that there's just simply less people and less institutions. The US has just such a staggering number of universities. And I wouldn't necessarily say, I think Canada could have an outsized impact, but the scale is something that I wonder about, especially.
To the question about the curation network, sorry, Bo, the curation network that it's not established, but we have a curation team working nationally on deposits into the Federated Research Data Repository. And they have, as one of their initiatives, been working on a community of practice around curation, and running a number of water coolers and such to basically build up that nascent sort of network. It is not formal like the DCN. It is not running in that same fashion, but I think that may be part of the vision going forward. There was, in the ancient days of pre-pandemic, there was a curation workshop run to bring together people who were interested in mapping this out. And so that took place, I think, in the fall of 2019 in Hamilton, Ontario. And we had a paper developed from that identifies the directions for curation in Canada.
Yeah, and maybe I was just going to add, and I hope this is on point, but I think it's unrealistic to expect that all institutions can do this. And you know, I think Jeff raised the question around capacity, and I think that's very real, right? So capacity in terms of resources, which could be people, could be financial, could be technology. And so that just goes to the notion of having these networks and having national, regional initiatives that can help sort of level the playing field for some of these institutions. I mean, in the research enterprise itself, researchers network across institutions already and leverage resources at different institutions. So I think it's the same sort of thing here. As this becomes part of your research, you will find how you can do this. But expecting all institutions to do it, I don't think that's realistic. That's my opinion.
Those are all fair points, and I think people will find that valuable. This the honest truth. Now, moving on, Jeff, I see you started typing an answer to this one, but it's still in the live Q&A. And it's about the expectation of the tri-agency when it comes to the deposit of sensitive data and where people might be pointed to. And, you know, we want to encourage people to anonymize the data sets and things like that. But there's also this option and a growing trend of people creating metadata-only records for the deposition in things like Dataverse and then storing the data on a secure server at their institution. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a bit about what these recommendations are now, what they might look like in the future, and how sensitive data will be treated. And Jeff, because you started typing that answer, I'm going to start with you, but obviously opinions from everybody are much welcome.
Yeah, I couldn't figure out why I would type half of an answer and it would just then disappear on me. So anyway, I think that all the things that were sort of alluded to in the question, in fact, are legitimate options. And I think the metadata, indexing metadata for sensitive data and then pointing back to a secure location is one way of managing this. I think it's worth mentioning a major initiative of the Alliance RDM related to the Federated Research Data Repository, which seems to have so many different roles. We need to do some rebranding. It's a discovery layer. It's a repository, and now it is part of a project that's being done in concert with Simon Fraser University to pilot a sensitive data repository, which would see research data, sensitive research data generated by researchers, encrypted and deposited in encrypted form in a further sensitive data repository, and have a key, an unlocking key, stored in another location. And then requesters would go through a process and policies, et cetera, to request access to the data. And then the encrypted package and the key would be united on that researcher's desktop and under appropriate signing and so on and so forth. They decrypt the package and make use of those data. It's still, I'm not articulating as well as my esteemed colleagues would, in particular Victoria Smith, our policy, privacy, and sensitive data coordinator. She can articulate this so much better than I can. But that is one pilot that is an attempt to deal with both the technical side of storing sensitive data, but also the, I think, larger and more intractable policy side of dealing with sensitive data. As she would sort of suggest, we've got a number of jurisdictions across Canada, provincially and territorially. We also have institutions with particular policies and structures in place. And navigating that for a national sensitive data repository would be impossible without some sort of overarching policy framework that is harmonized in some fashion. So that is the ambitious vision of this pilot. But I think that there are other options out there. There are secure data enclaves. We have the Institute for Clinical and Evaluative Sciences in Ontario. We have the Canadian Research Data Center Network, which is another model for providing access to highly sensitive data. So there are a lot of technology and creative ways of approaching this, but we're still treating this as a work of art in progress. We're working on this.
Yeah, maybe I could just jump in here too, Jeff, because I thought this was a really good question and a really timely sort of question. And if you think of the whole data life cycles, there's a lot of discussion at my home institution, Toronto, of looking at how do we store and analyze and access this type of information, especially around health information. So it's taking a big chunk of our time sort of thinking about it. And I think Jeff has given some good examples of how it works, but I think we're getting pushed to make it a little bit more ubiquitous, the access to it. I found it interesting, sort of the notion of creating the metadata, which I really like, and putting that up into these public systems, and then putting it on a secure system at our home institution. And I kind of wonder, well, is that the most secure solution? And it might not be, unless that system is physically separated from the network and actually sitting in a vault somewhere. So this notion that things that are on your home campus are the most secure, that's not always the best approach. And we got to look at other solutions that will do this more effectively. So I'll leave it at that.
And if I can just jump in quickly with another example of an initiative. Kevin Reed, who is the chair of our Discovery and Metadata Expert Group, is leading a project called the Access Restricted Data Working Group. And what they're doing is surfacing difficult to access, difficult to obtain restricted data sets, surfacing the existence of them, and then building metadata records that can then point back to the home repository, the home location of those restricted or hard, difficult to access data sets in order to open the door for negotiated access. So if you know that something exists for the government of Canada, but it's locked down, how do we expose those records from a metadata perspective and then pave the way for appropriate access? So those are, that's just another example of how we're addressing this, and it speaks to the metadata suggestion that was implicit in the question.
Danielle, do you have anything to add from your perspective and maybe the American context at all? And if not, I'm not trying to put you on the spot or anything, but just out of
no, but I definitely think that working group sounds really cool. I'm like making notes. I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. I really like that.
Oh, love that. All right, so moving forward, we have an interesting question, and one that I personally haven't given much thought to is looking at the climate-friendly aspects of data deposit. And there's work being done to consider the environmental impact of data preservation. And does this work informed by the Alliance being done with Dataverse and things like that? Is it taking into consideration? And I'm not sure, Jeff, if you can speak to this, but it's a very interesting question that was highly upvoted.
I'm not speaking out of turn here because I think this was a sort of a public post by Nizar Nadek, our CEO here at the Digital Alliance, Research Alliance of Canada. And he was talking about, in the context of data centers, he was talking about the vast amount of energy that are consumed by these data centers. And that piqued in me the realization that if we are to selectively preserve data sets of note, there is a cost to that. There's a cost in dollars. There's a cost in people and dollars. People and dollars are always tied together. But there's also a carbon footprint associated with that. And so I think that I cannot speak for the Alliance on this, but I would think that if you were to talk to Nizar or others, they would certainly look at this this issue of the carbon footprint of data and big data and storing data for the long term as a key element of what it is that the Alliance needs to be thinking about as Canada with its government policies around climate change and global warming has to be taken into account in all that we do. So I don't have the answer for you, but I know that that's something that our CEO has mentioned specifically as a component of this larger ARC piece.
So we don't, I like Jeff, I thought this was a really interesting question. I read it and I went, wow, okay, how would we answer this? And I think the honest answer is that, yeah, I haven't really thought about it. Not directly, but indirectly, we think about it at the university. And if we were to build a new building, I can't get a data center in there unless it meets certain standards from an environmental perspective, because the building has to have, by 2050, we have to be carbon neutral. So the building actually has to push back into it. So it's not directly thinking about this problem, but it's indirectly thinking about this problem. And so I couldn't put all that data somewhere in a new building without pushing it over some bar unless we made some changes, which we can do, which we are doing.
Well, it's great to hear that these things are being thought of, and just I think, yeah, as time marches on, they'll become more adept. Now, I'm just going to ask this question just so people can hear it. It's already been answered. There was, is Dataverse Canada different than Scholars Portal Dataverse? And it seems it's just a rebranding. So sorry for all the confusion that caused people. Unless, Jeff, is that correct? We confirm that?
Scholars Portal Dataverse is a service of the Ontario Council of University Libraries, so 21 or 22 libraries in Ontario. And it is housed at the University of Toronto and run by the Scholars Portal Initiative, which is again an OCL, or Ontario Council of University Libraries initiative. They've been serving the 21, 22 university libraries in Ontario for many, many years with a number of fantastic resources, including the Odyssey data system, OLRC, the Ontario Library Research Cloud, and a range of really cool shared resources. What this Dataverse Canada is an offering of that Dataverse service that's been offered up for some time now to the OCL libraries, to the broader Canadian community. And they've been doing that through a subscription service. And don't even ask me what the price tag is, but it's a very reasonable annual fee to get a piece of the Dataverse, if you will, to have your own local Dataverse branded under Scholars Portal. And with that service, you have access to all the updates that they keep it up to date. They do all the good work to keep the Dataverse running, the latest updates and so on, which would be incredibly more expensive if you were to do that on your own on your local campus. We, the Alliance, are supporting that by funding a part of the costs of running that service. So the fees are lower to the individual subscribing institutions as a consequence of the Alliance ponying up a certain amount of funds to support that service. Okay,
awesome. And it's good that you mentioned it. Someone did ask how much it costs, but I've been instructed not to ask, and so I won't. I have the number 5,000 in my head, but I think it's a sliding scale depending on size of the institution. So please don't quote me on that. I would be remiss in having that number bandied about unwittingly. Yeah, I'm sure that this person could reach out to either Dataverse or someone to get a more accurate quote for their institution.
Yes, indeed.
All right, so moving on, and this is, I think, a very general question, but could probably talk about some current efforts happening as well as future efforts, and just understanding that data literacy is really at the key to this, both for researchers and those who can help serve researchers. And they're asking about how we can promote data literacy training as a fundamental part of these type of projects. Jeff, I might pick on you just because I think you have a good view of all the training happening now, but everyone else, please feel free to jump in as well.
I think there have been a couple of questions sort of that I could say dance somewhat around this. If we circle back to the data storage continuum where we started with that active storage phase, it's when researchers are sitting down and formulating an idea and collecting data and starting to crunch numbers and work with data. Data literacy is so important to the research that's happening in the active storage phase. I think that the work that needs to happen there is well known. as a data librarian for the last 35 years, or the early part of my last 35 years, I've seen that. People need to know more about how to wrangle data, how to analyze data, how to look at data intelligently, and tease out of it what it is that they need in order to answer society's big questions. That being said, they still at the same time need to know how to manage that data. They can do wonderful work and run their regressions and all the great stuff, and they can be really crappy managers of their data. And I don't think any of you need to think too hard or long about examples of people coming up with really brilliant information out of the research, but then turning back to an incredibly messy spreadsheet where they've got formula and things and everything's been whatever. It's just a mishmash, or a dog's breakfast of stuff. The information may be valid, but nobody can ever turn back and say, how did you arrive at that conclusion? As correct and as valid as that conclusion might be. So I do think that data literacy is incredibly important, but it goes, I think, hand in hand with data management. One supports the other. And so we at, in the Alliance and formerly Portage have been long advocates of data literacy, but it is sort of a shared responsibility. I think there's a lot of responsibility out there in the data librarian world for this, and they've been doing this for years and years and years. I think that we would certainly work with them on that. And I think the opportunities that present themselves with the ARC community coming into the Alliance as of April 1st of next year lets us tip into the active storage phase of the high performance computing folks and help them understand that as they're crunching the numbers, maybe they could also be managing the numbers. So I'll stop there.
No, that was a great and holistic answer, and I think much appreciated. Bo, Danielle, did you have anything to add to data literacy training? Okay, cool, no problem if you don't. So plowing forward, we have an interesting question about when a project has been carried out entirely in French. Is it possible to share the data also in French? And they're looking at general, please explain in general for different repositories in terms of Further and Dataverse, do they support these bilingual options?
That's an excellent question. My sense is researchers can deposit whatever it is that they generate data-wise. And if it's in French, we have a team of curators for Further, for example, where the data would be curated into the repository in the language, the official language of their choice. So I don't think there's any issue whatsoever with data being deposited into Further or Dataverse for that matter in the language of the researcher's choice. And that could extend beyond English and French if people were inclined to do so. Clearly, from a discovery perspective, they might want to broaden out the linguistic diversity of the metadata so that we can actually discover those data in various portals and with various language limitations of Canadians. But yeah, no issues there at all in my view.
Can I jump in there 1 second just to say that another approach to that is a lot of the development work in the semantic web, creating ontologies, machine actionable ontologies that can be published in any language, and then you can write crosswalks between them. Would be another automated approach to that, which is still in its infancy and has a long way to go. But yeah.
That's a great point. And we have our first person who's raised their hand for a vocal question. So Ernie, I'm going to allow you to talk. Did someone allow you to talk already? Okay.
I did.
Oh, thanks, Jen. You're always watching my back.
Sure.
So Ernie, go ahead.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think I'm on. Yes, okay. Yeah, reason I wanted to speak is because Wendy and I and Karen, among others, just finished a session this morning on Side Data Cloud. I was talking about the work going on in national committees around the world. Well, not all of them, but a number of them who are CODATA members. And training came up again and again and again. But it wasn't just RDM and the curation. There were two things that came up: data science and curation. I guess this was curation that came up. And the Israelis presented their ideas, and they said, "Well, we're developing a program to start focusing on data literacy, data skills in grade 10 and above." going all the way to the PhD level. And they're developing a strategy to work at every different level. I know that in Canada, back in the days of ESTAT and so on, we had a very active high school program. I don't know what's happened to it, but the other thing that people pointed to was the fact that there was a need to consider the implementation of the data schools for data science integration training that has been coming out of the CODATA RDA data schools. And this is something that's on the agenda. And to me, it complements very well what we're talking about here. So I think that's all I can say.
That's a great addition, Ernie. I think data science definitely plays an active role in this. Are there any comments for Ernie's suggestions here or comment there?
Ernie and I have had conversations current and in the past about the importance of data literacy and data science. The remit of Alliance RDM is research data management and the good practices and best practices around that. And as I said earlier, they go hand in glove with good data science and good data literacy. And in as much as they do, I think that we have an interest in seeing better data literacy in Canada. But I think we need to think of how that intersects with the RDM aspect of the Alliance. I don't know that it's the specific remit of Alliance RDM, but it's something that we certainly have an interest in seeing advanced.
All right. Doesn't look like anyone else has anything to say, but Ernie, yeah, a lot of people are supporting what you said in the chat, so that's a very relevant point. Now, moving on to a question, and Bo, I see that you would like to answer this one, so I'll pose it to you, but is there a project to collaborate to offer to Canadian researchers the most exhaustive list of subject discipline data repositories? I do see that people have answered that textually, but Bo, I'll let you take it.
Yeah, that's more like a CIO faux pas on the technology. I clicked it and I didn't know how to unclick it. I mean, I think I didn't catch it in the chat, but Jeff talked about it at the beginning about further. I think beginning to collect that for a whole bunch of different repositories and information around that. I also know that the Digital Repositories Expert Group has a list of the repositories. I'm not sure we've determined if we're making that publicly accessible or how we would make that public accessible is probably the better approach to it. I don't know if Jeff, you want to expand on further? Or?
We worked from the Re3 data repository inventory and identified Canadian repositories and actually helped that index clean up its Canadian content so that we've got a more thorough and complete and live list of Canadian repositories. And I think the number was in and around 200 Canadian repositories that were identified. And of those, as I mentioned in my talk, 90 of them have had their metadata harvested and indexed within the further discovery layer. So that service is now exposing data within those 90 repositories. The other 100 or so, 100 and change, are being worked on. There are many reasons which I am not in a position to really dive into, but related to metadata and crosswalks that would have made it more challenging to get those indexed. But there is a goal of indexing more and more Canadian repositories to expose their data and or get them to work with the further team to upgrade their metadata so that it is harvestable using one of our crosswalks.
That's great. All right, so moving forward, we have another question about training, and this one is specifically asking about training on data access licenses, saying it's very important to deposits. I'm just wondering, is there anything on the frontier or currently offered about that type of training?
I'm going to interpret this as related back to the ethics piece and appropriate access to data that would otherwise not be open. We have developed a sensitive data toolkit within Portage historically and within the Alliance RDM. And that toolkit includes a vocabulary, a dictionary of terms that are used within the context of sensitive data, but it also includes some guiding text for ethics applications and for informed consent. And both of those are precursors to having some sort of agreement around access. And so I don't think we've got anything specific beyond the work of our policy, privacy, and sensitive data coordinator, who's doing a lot of work in this space on policies and such. That toolkit does not include anything speaking specifically to data access agreements, but I know that the sensitive data repository pilot that we're working on has as a major component coming up with a harmonized data access framework, policy framework, to avoid, dealing with Newfoundland and Labrador's rules, Ontario's rules, Quebec's rules, British Columbia's rules, having a consistent framework so that data that are sensitive and need to be accessed can be accessed through one rather than a mosaic of policy or access frameworks. So I don't know if that answers the question, but there's work being done in that space.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And then this goes for everybody. If there are clarifications that you want, please don't hesitate to jump in and ask for those clarifications. All right, so I think that this question is really asking about how all of the pillars from the strategy tie into one another. However, I might be misinterpreting that. So if this person's question isn't answered, please chime in, but I'll read it as it's written. They see the pertinence of data sharing for pillars 1 and 2 in the strategy, but the relevance is not so clear for pillars 3 and 4, which are focused on highly contextualized research processes, which include and require a participatory component from stakeholders to ensure relevance and buy-in for the results. And they're wondering if they're missing something in this interpretation. I'm not sure if people can speak to that. Jose, we can absolutely unmute you, sorry. If that's something you want to provide clarification for, but Jeff, I see you reaching towards your keyboard to unmute yourself.
Yeah, you're just way too discerning, because I was reaching across to unmute. I'm not sure that I understand the question, to be honest. The policy pillars are an institutional research data management strategy, data management planning, and deposit. And so I'm not sure if those are the pillars that are being talked about, or whether we're talking about some other set of pillars related to of the Alliance or something else. So I'm wondering if we could get some clarification as to what was meant.
Unfortunately, that person is no longer here, so we're never going to know.
Oh, no. So yeah, I didn't know how to interpret that question. So
yeah, no, I think it is one of those things, but yeah, if the question arises again, but I think that the connectivity between potentially the pillars, but I don't want to offer my interpretation to that question.
no.
Okay, so plowing forward. Institutional Dataverse can also be considered a showcase of a university's research output. If data are being deposited in discipline-specific repositories, would it be appropriate to have metadata record in an institutional data course that point to the data sets in disciplinary repositories?
That's an excellent question. And on the surface of it, the practical me, and other people could weigh in, practical me would say, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. It'll just increase exposure and so on. The other practical me would say, not a good idea, because if I understand it correctly, when you deposit something into Dataverse, a DOI would be minted, and then you'd have a DOI for the metadata record, and you'd have a DOI for the data. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily a best practice. And I'm probably not the best person to weigh in on what that best practice would be, but I would be concerned about having questions about whose DOI do I point to. But we've already talked about publishing metadata in one place and having it referred to elsewhere. But I don't think further in the indexing Mensa DOI for its metadata only records. And I've got Lee Wilson's on the call. I can see him there, and he could maybe unmute and weigh in on this a bit better than I could. But he may not be at his desk, so I don't want to call him out. So.
Oh, we have the mysterious Lee Wilson who's there muted. Well, we can move on to that. I think that's an important answer. And
yeah, I've got somebody in the chat telling me that don't do that. Don't mint DOIs for metadata records and don't mint a DOI for a real record. I think we've got some measure of endorsement from the chat community.
the people have spoken.
The people have spoken.
All right, and so I'm going through this in order based on upvotes. I see that Wendy, who asked the question about the data literacy training, feels like she wanted some clarification on her question. Wendy, I'm going to unmute you if you'd like to speak to this one a little bit. Can you hear me, Wendy? Oh, hold on. It doesn't look.
There we go.
Perfect.
Yep. My thing is that what we need is, what we don't have are the people, a lot of the people who are dealing with the data aren't quite literate about what the data mean or things like that. So we're thinking, Ernie and I wrote a white paper for the white paper series, and I think we make a pretty good argument in that. It's only about a page and a half, and what it does, it kind of states that data literacy is something that really is needed. And if you have people dealing with data that aren't data literate, you run into problems that can be easily solved once they're trained. And I think that, you talk about data science, and I didn't realize that I was a data scientist until I started working at the Data Science Institute at Carleton. And it's the same thing. I just wasn't counting the same things. So we really do need a good background in some data science. And you can call it data literacy, you can call it just basic stats. But if you have an idea about how you can measure things and whether things make sense, you have an idea about how you're going to store them. So is that?
Well, I totally agree.
My stream of consciousness is over now.
I totally agree with you, Wendy.
Yeah.
We absolutely need more data science and more data literacy in whatever form we can get.
All right, yeah, thanks for that, Wendy. Or
Yeah. You're welcome.
all right, so moving on, and I think this goes with a lot of the questions around Indigenous data that we heard yesterday, and they're asking if anybody in the group has any expertise dealing with Aboriginal or Métis data. I'm not sure if that's an expertise that lies within this group, but I know that there are those within the Portage sphere who are working on things like this.
Yeah, this is an incredibly important aspect of the work of Alliance RDM, and I would extend that to include the Alliance writ large. One of the early things that Nizar Ladak did, our CEO, in this space was to basically say everybody at the Alliance should take Ocap training. So Ocap is ownership, control, access, and possession, and it is a training program developed by the First Nations Information Governance Center. And it's I would highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in this topic. And it basically gives people a very cogent framework for approaching research with and about Indigenous, in this particular First Nations in particular, in this context, nations. And so we have a strong interest in this space. We are, as early as earlier today, we were talking about on another meeting about how we would be able to engage Indigenous communities in something like, and this is still very, very, very nascent, so don't quote me on this, but in something like a speaker series to help inform the community and gather information to help us generate, co-develop guidance around research with Indigenous communities and nations. And so there's a lot of work happening in this space. There's a lot of interest in this space, but it is it's not a quick process. It's a long relationship building, communication process, and there is no solution overnight. We're working on this with our partners, Indigenous partners, but it's in the early stages, and we know that there's a lot more work to do.
Yeah, and I'm just seeing people in the chat just pumping up Ocap and understanding the importance of that. So it's great to see everybody wanting to be involved in this type of thing. Going over to the next question, it's a clarification about a previous question about data licensing training. They were asking more specifically about Creative Commons and that type of license training, and will that be offered in any time in the future?
Great suggestion. That's all I can say. Great suggestion. I know that we try and make all of our publications and resources Creative Commons licensed in one form or another. Yeah, we're good. I think it's a great idea. We could certainly, and Jen is listening. She's just texted me saying that we've got to run in a few minutes and do an interview. So I will have to leave this call, but Jen is our training coordinator. And I think that's just a great idea for some sort of an output. I expect that there are things out there on Creative Commons already, so we may not have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to find where those kinds of resources exist.
Yeah, that's great. And yes, Jen is an amazing resource. We can do it with the training group, but I think that's a great suggestion as well. This is a question specifically about Further. I know Lee might be lurking in the background, but it's asking about that 1 terabyte quota and if people can get larger allocations than that. I know that there have been some arrangements made, but Lee, are you listening? If not, Jeff, I might pass it to you.
Oh, you can't even imagine how hopeful I am that the little red microphone unmutes. Okay, well, I'll take a stab at this and have words with Lee later. No, the 1 terabyte allocation is something that we've worked very closely with Compute Canada to articulate. We wanted to make sure that we weren't overstating, and it's just an experience with Compute Canada that if you have this many researchers and you offer them all a terabyte, only a small fraction will make use of that, because many will use maybe a gigabyte or 0 or whatever. And so they've got very robust, many years of experience modeling this, and they know. So the 1 terabyte was what we put out there. I believe that we can entertain requests for modest increases in that from a terabyte. Anything that tips over a certain threshold, which I'm not going to quote right now, would involve more detailed discussion, shall we say. There may end up having to be some sort of exchange of funds. That model is being worked on as we speak. And there's Lee. He's just texting me somewhere on Slack, and I didn't have a chance to read it because it disappeared. And I do not multitask well, so I'm focusing primarily on you guys.
And your presence is much appreciated, Jeff.
Oh, there we go. Stay focused, Jeff. Stay focused.
Oh, you got it. All right. Well, that's a great answer. And yes, please, if you do have questions about that, I'd reach out to the Further team. Like Jeff said, they would be happy to entertain your discussions. So I think that really is a conversation if you have it. And so to one more question, this is the last one. People want to get more in before things end, but what involvement does the Alliance have in the nascent TCPS clause on broad consent for data deposit? Are they advisors in this discussion? And they're speaking from a perspective where there are concerns on workflow and implications on withdrawing consent.
Wow.
Yes.
I notice you're not offering Bo that question. We have a policy privacy and sensitive data coordinator who would be able to dance circles around that question in ways that I won't even begin to. So what I'm going to do is suggest that if that person wants to reach out to any of us here at the Alliance, my email is jeff.moon@engagedri.ca. If you send me your question, I will forward it to Victoria, who is victoria.smith@engagedri.ca, and she would be happy to answer that question.
Yeah, that was an amazing question, and I respect that you want to refer it to the person who would be able to.
I wouldn't be able to do it justice.
Okay, so I'm seeing the Q&A as an empty queue. Are there any final questions in the chat or in the Q&A before we get out of here, or it's just people are just feel so filled up with knowledge that this has been it?
I think this is probably a good place to wrap it up.
I think so as well. Just wanted to give people a last chance, though.
That's very kind of you, Nick. Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining us today for this session on data deposit. In case you missed that part, this was about data deposit. Thanks so much to our presenters today, Jeff Moon, Bo Wanschneider, Karen Payne, and Danielle Cooper, to Nick Rocklin for hosting the Q&A, to our technical support on the back end, Beth Kazuk, Lee Wilson, and to our wonderful interpreters, merci encore. Hope to see many, if not all of you, back tomorrow for our webinar session on the institutional strategies themselves, and I know we'll see some of you as well in the afternoon workshop. Until then, have a great rest of your Tuesday, and we will see you all very soon.